Love has been described as being a mini splendor thing, a large celebrity-packed cruise ship from the 70s and 80s, and soft as an easy chair. Love has also been described as, well, it hurts. Love and marriage was once described as going together like a horse and carriage, until the wheel falls off of the carriage, or the horse runs away, and the carriage goes over a cliff. I hear you saying, get on with it, TMN. Enough with analogies. Fine. Divorce. That's what we have today. And what we have is one ugly divorce. Divorces can be amicable and said to genuinely be for the best interest of all parties. But when you have moolah, oi, that's where the ugliness can come in. I could tell this particular story for hours, but I had to cut it way down. You can thank me later. We're in 1919, already at the beginning of the end. Our players in this divorce drama: William Earl Dodge, aka W.E.D. Stokes, and his wife Helen Elwood Stokes. Mr. Stokes has filed suit against his wife Helen. The couple were married in 1911, some 10 years after Stokes had attained a divorce from his then wife Rita. Stokes and Helen had met while she was living at the Hotel Ansonia, which he just happened to have owned. At that time, he was about 60 years old. She was about 25. Stokes is part of a prominent New York family, as a horse breeder, railway president, and I already mentioned the hotel ownership. Helen's father was the inventor of barbed wire, so she was also fine. We're at October 1919 now. When the suit was filed earlier in the year, people were not in the know about the specific matters of the divorce. The why, mainly. Well, we got at least one of the whys. Attorneys for Helen submitted to the Supreme Court affidavits from Helen and 3 co-respondents denying the charges against her that had been laid by her millionaire husband. She also submitted, because why not, we're already here at the courthouse, a motion to dismiss the complaint, and she requested a legal separation from her husband and the custody of their 2 children, a son 5 years old and a daughter 4. So we still don't know the full why yet, but it's apparent that she's committed some sort of misconduct with her stepson nicknamed Weddy, Mr. Stokes' son, and with one Roland Miller, stepbrother of Helen, and with Harold Billig, Helen's cousin, and with George Schroeder, I don't know his relation, and with, quote, persons unknown to Mr. Stokes, end quote. Her complaint response denies all of these charges. Well, hot diggity dog, that's a lot. Okay, we're just a few days later. Helen plans to file suit of conspiracy against Stokes and his son, Weddy, plus wanting a separation, alimony, counsel fees, and revoking the deed she had signed that disposed of her dower rights. Helen said, quote, I am going to fight to clear my own name and protect the future of our children. I want to efface, too, the stain on the reputation of my stepbrother, Roland Miller, and my cousin, Harold Billig, by Mr. Stokes' complaint. My life with Mr. Stokes is a white page, save for the shadows he has put on it. I shall fight till the end for my children with no fear of his money or his influence. October 24th. Stokes filed with the justice his reply to the counterclaim his wife put forth for separation and alimony. He filed with the papers a note written to him by his son, Weddy. Quote, my darling Pop, I am sorry to say I was intimate with Helen at Narragansett Pier this fall. W.E.D. Stokes, Jr., end quote. In Stokes' response in the separation suit of his wife, he denies all material facts alleged, including one of cruelty. He says not only he had never attempted to choke his wife, but she actually had scratched his face so bad that he had to stay at home for a week, and that she also threatened to kill him. He denies any profanities used towards her, but that she was the one using the bad words. Well, then Helen filed a suit to cancel a document she signed in 1911 when they wed that turned over 25 parcels of property he owned over to a realty company that he also owned, valued at $1 million. Remember, we're in 1919. That's a heck of a lot of dough. Apparently, this was alleged by her to be a conspiracy to defraud her of her dower rights in the estate of her husband. Now, I admit I'm not up on these types of claims, but I'm assuming that the 25 parcels of land was to be hers as part of her dower rights in case something happened to the marriage. But she signed them away to his own realty company, so not really hers regardless? Anyway, not sure I understand all that, but she said she basically didn't understand what she was signing. She reiterates that she believes her husband was addicted to drugs. He denies that. He says that he does not deny the legitimacy of his children with Helen, so there is no point of contention with that. But he denies what she said about him wanting to cut the kids adrift, and by the fact that he too has asked for custody is indication of that in his divorce suit. So Helen has filed affidavits from Miller, Billig, Schroeder, and Weddy denying improper relations with her. October 26, 1919. The judge of the Supreme Court of the County of New York has signed an order requiring Stokes to pay Helen alimony of $1,500 per month plus an additional $7,500 in counsel fees. November 19th. Helen apparently filed a bill of particulars stating that he was a habitual drug user and used vulgar language in front of their children. He accused her of being friendly with other men who she says she doesn't even know. He had a violent temper, abused the maid and cook. He demands that she make the bill more detailed. Her response was that in the fall of 1918, he demanded that she give him hypodermic injections and asked one of the servants to do the same. His addiction was to such an extent that she feared for her children. She refused in her response to provide the exact vulgar language used, but that she would at the upcoming hearing. She also alleges that he's had her watched by detectives, chauffeurs, and other employees, and that they were to report to him her goings-on. In addition, he had circulated fake reports by her and his son, and that he had smuggled a man into their apartment at the Hotel Ansonia solely so he could bring about accusations against her. December 1st. Helen was given temporary custody of their 2 children. February 1920. She has been awarded permanent custody of their 2 children by Judge Ben Lindsay of Denver. Helen lives in Denver. Put a pushpin into his name. Nothing much happening the rest of 1920. Take a big old deep breath and drink of whatever you like because things are about to get right contentious. January 1921. So we still have all of these suits flying around. Stokes would like to change his own divorce suit to add another co-respondent of what I am assuming is another alleged hanky-panky with Helen. She says she has a letter from this man stating that the charges were untrue. February 20th, 1921. Judge Ford has denied Stokes' application for custody of his children. He also dismissed Stokes' desire to have the children brought into the court. Apparently, Stokes wants them there so that if things go his way, the children are right there and boom, he can take them home. Currently, they are living in Denver with their mother, and while she's attending the trial in New York, her mother is caring for them. March 18, 1921. We're already at trial. Several witnesses have stated that they saw Helen in the apartment of one Edgar T. Wallace, oil guy. But did she have a look-alike? One witness, Mrs. Emma E. Goodwin, who was a corset specialist, had her business very near to where Mr. Wallace lived. She testified that Helen came into her shop to use her phone and was the same woman she saw going in and out of Mr. Wallace's place. Well, then there was a bit of a hiccup. Quote, I would not want anyone to be hanged upon my testimony. So far as I am able, I am telling the truth. There may be someone who looks exactly like her. End quote. Someone who looks enough like her to be a twin? Asked Mr. Wellman, counsel for Stokes. Yes, the witness replied. Do you now testify that this woman is the one who was in your place of business once between 1915 and 1919? Yes, unless she has a double, was the qualifying answer. Mr. Littleton, Helen's counsel, was later asked about the possibility of a double. Quote, I don't know anything about that. I do know that Mrs. Stokes was never seen by these witnesses, as they allege. End quote. Mr. Wallace, currently in San Francisco, has denied that he has seen Helen since 1910, the year before she married Stokes. This goes against witnesses in Mr. Wallace's apartment, saying they have seen her there numerous times between 1914 and 1918. Mr. Wallace apparently will be traveling to New York to appear in court. Other witnesses for Stokes: Lillian Payne, Mr. Wallace's maid; Margaret Conway, trained nurse seen with her mother, Mrs. Miller, at Mr. Wallace's; Mary McNulty, tea room waitress at a location near Wallace's place, saw Wallace in the tea room and going to his place, and then Helen at the tea room and going up to his place. Helen's lawyer asked for another $10,000 to pay expenses and counsel fees. The judge allowed for $7,500. Adjournment for a period of time while Helen's team refutes these new charges regarding Wallace. April 5th. Helen filed an amended complaint in which she denies the Wallace charges and states that Stokes is spreading false information that she had poisoned a former husband. Her affidavit read, quote, "Since October 1st, 1920, the plaintiff represented to Benjamin F. Harrison that before her marriage to the plaintiff, the defendant had contracted marriages in Denver and Chicago. Harrison, Mrs. Stokes alleges, was, quote, employed to get evidence lending the color of truth to said false representations," end quote. Also, quote, "At various times since October 12, 1919, the plaintiff has sent letters to the children through the mails addressed to them, but concocted and intended for the defendant's perusal, reflecting on her character," end quote. April 7th, 1921, Mr. Littleton, Mrs. Stokes' counsel, said, quote, "Mrs. Stokes will be the first witness for the defense when the trial reopens. Her story on the stand will be one of the most remarkable revelations ever heard in any court in any land. When she describes what she has gone through at Stokes' hand and supports her statements with proof, the world of thinking men and women will be astounded that any man could inflict so much suffering on any woman. We will prove that Stokes sought to show that his wife was the mother of illegitimate children, and that he personally combed disreputable resorts in New York, Chicago, and Denver in a mad attempt to secure evidence, but that he was absolutely unsuccessful in discovering a single fact that could discredit her. We will bring witnesses from each city to show just what he said to them and what he offered them. This divorce suit, which he is now prosecuting, is but part of a systematic persecution with a terrible object of view. We will lay that object before the world," end quote. Helen said she will, quote, "make him pay in blood for the shame he has brought upon me," end quote. April 7th, Edgar Wallace made the trip across the country to testify. He said he did live at this location from 1913 to 1917, where he was allegedly seen with Helen. But he denied ever seeing her there, or anywhere for that matter, since she married Stokes, and in fact hasn't seen her since the spring of 1909, when he stopped the acquaintance, and he also denied that he had ever been in love with her. His maid, Martha, testified that one Mrs. Lacroix d'Aquinas had offered her money to testify in support of Stokes, and she had rejected the offer. Apparently, another Stokes lady friend had visited her as well, asking if she knew Helen. Oh, that's not a good look. But regardless, Martha said she had not set eyes on Helen in that apartment. Mr. Wallace said, quote, "I came here to testify because I was anxious to contradict lies I read in the papers about me," end quote. Mr. Smith, Stokes' counsel, said, quote, "If you had had intimate relations with Mrs. Stokes, would you omit them? Tell the time and occasion." "I would," replied Mr. Wallace. "On the stand and before the public?" "Yes." "If you had had relations with a married woman, would you omit those relations, knowing that would fasten a crime on a married woman?" "If it was Mrs. Stokes, would you make such an admission under oath, fastening such a crime against the state on her?" "I would." April 14th. Helen's lawyer called out the witness, saying that it would have been physically impossible to have seen what he alleged to have seen. At one point, the architect, Matiosian, said, quote, "I don't know just how I could see, but I know that I did see." Mr. Wallace's lawyer, Mr. Wise, cut in, quote, "Then you must have curved eyes that see in a circle, or else you must have balanced over the coping of the roof like an acrobat. And which was it?" After this went on for a bit, Judge Finch took a field trip to the former apartment of witnesses, where allegedly someone saw through a window Helen in Wallace's apartment, scantily clad. There was no comment made about what he thought. The architect continued to be asked, continued to seemingly falter. Matiosian admitted that he had been given money by Stokes and a promise of a position. Wow. Another co-respondent accused of hanky-panky, George Schroeder, denied intimacy with Helen, no kissy or huggy, but he did call her carrots, not as an endearment, but because she had big red hair. He denied Stokes' charges. April 16th. It came out today that 2 years ago, Stokes had offered to settle with her privately and give her $1,500 a month and to give 1/3 property to their children. Helen was willing to separate, but not divorce, but could not agree on the amount of money. Stokes has said of this attempt to settle, quote, "I offered her everything, money, the custody of our 2 children. I wanted to have her sue me for divorce, a secret proceeding, to spare her from all this publicity, but she tricked me," end quote. Her side of this, She had been given 24 hours to agree to sue her husband. She said no. She doesn't believe in divorce. Blah, 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 muckety, muckety, muck, and neither would relent, and here we are. April 19th. So there were several correspondents that were being accused of misconduct with Helen. Helen's lawyer, Littleton, motioned for dismissal of the alleged misconduct with one Samuel M. Roosevelt, an artist who apparently is deceased, Will Myers, a school friend of Helen, and Roland Miller, her stepbrother. April 21st. Helen's mother, Emma Miller, is on the stand. She wasn't fond of Stokes, thought Helen was throwing her life away when the two married. She apparently was called out for some lovely writing she had sent to Stokes. She said, quote, "It was poetic license, it's not literally true," end quote. She reiterated that Helen didn't believe in divorce. April 23rd. Helen's on the stand denying all assertions made by her husband, said her husband had a mini poultry farm in their apartment, as many as 45 chickens at one time. Dude, surely you could have afforded to buy some nice property outside for them. She said that Stokes had strange women in the apartment. When confronted about the men she was alleged to have been with, she knew dates and times from her little black book. Do people still have these anymore? And was able to prove that she couldn't have been there. Again, denied all charges about her being in Wallace's apartment. April 26th. So the whole thing with cousin Billig. He's allegedly some sort of cousin to Helen and that he was coming to visit for New Year's. A couch was brought in and put into a hallway between her bedroom and the library. She had asked Stokes to put the couch in the library, but he never did. The guests arrived, they went out for New Year's and returned. Stokes met them on the second floor and wanted to speak to her, accusing her of lying about Billig being her cousin. Stokes and Helen got into it. Billig heard some of it. Stokes stating that he would stay up all night, I'm assuming to make sure Billig and Helen didn't engage in hanky-panky. Billig was like, "To heck with this, I'm out," and he left. Over and over on the stand, she was asked about certain events, and she referred to her book and was able to refute the accusation. She went on to talk about his cruelty to her during her pregnancy when he wouldn't give her money to buy baby clothes, when she asked him not to have parties in the house while she was in her condition, and he ignored her. She had to eat special foods during her pregnancy. When a servant served her some, he fired the servant, and she wasn't able to eat until the next afternoon. Billig testified, denied hanky-panky charges. April 27th. Helen testified that her husband's counsel tried to make her an offer of money settlement if she would divorce him and that Stokes would stop at nothing to divorce her. Helen testified regarding the offer, quote, "I replied that I would not consider such a proposition for even $50,000 a year. I told him I did not want a divorce and knew I had not done anything that would justify his getting one," end quote. April 28th. Helen's accusations of Stokes being cruel are coming into question while she's on the stand, his counsel reading her pages and pages of her love letters to him. Her response, quote, "They were perfectly natural letters, for I loved him. They were the letters any wife might write to her husband. I had forgiven him again and again. I was trying to make the best of a bad bargain. In spite of all he did, I loved him a little, even though I was unhappy from the first day I married him. I was trying to make the best of a bad bargain. At least they now know that I did not marry him for money, as he said. I tried to love him," end quote. Abruptly, Smith confronted her with a small blonde woman of approaching middle age, clad in blue. The lawyer introduced her as Madame Estelle, with whom the wife had said her husband was on more than friendly terms. Mrs. Stokes glanced once at the woman and responded, quote, "That is not Madame Estelle, and you know it." She was tall and slender. She offered to help me in this case. You know that is not the woman, end quote. At this emphatic statement, Smith retorted, quote, "Oh, I suppose everyone lies in this case except you," end quote. Mrs. Stokes repeated the denial. May 3rd. Apparently, a tall, dark man allegedly was seen going into Helen's room by a maid of Stokes. Well, apparently this man is Elliot Brown, who was a former roommate of her stepbrother at Yale, and he happens to be the opposite of the witness testimony. He is a small and light man of 23. He had met Helen in 1915. Stokes sometime not long after that when Elliot came to visit with Weddy to visit the stepbrother. While at Yale, he was a frequent visitor to the Stokes home about once a month. On the visit in question, he had come to the home with a young woman, and the pair went with Helen and others to dance. After everyone was dropped back off at home, Elliot and Helen returned to the house. He stayed in Stokes's room. Mr. Littleton, counsel for Mrs. Stokes. What did you do when you reached the Stokes home? He answered, we arrived there about 12:30 o'clock and separated at the front door. Mrs. Stokes went upstairs and I went to the kitchen where the cook had prepared a little supper for me, some chocolate cake. Afterward, I went up to Mr. Stokes' room and slept the night there. I did not see Mrs. Stokes till next morning. End quote. His friendship with her stepbrother had afforded him this closeness to the household. Also, pictures were being produced that allegedly showed Helen in some strange poses and/or with strange men. Helen was asked to come to the stand and asked her about some of the pictures, including one that was supposedly a nude. She denied knowing any of these people that she was supposed to have been in these pictures with, or being nude in a posed picture. She was asked, quote, is it not a fact that you went out without the knowledge of your husband to these parties, from which you generally wound up drunk at Mrs. Kearney's, and that you escaped from his apartment in the Ansonia Hotel, disguised as a little old woman, collecting for Dr. Taylor's church, and that you even talked with your husband and collected money from him and laughed at the way you were fooling him, end quote. Quote, that is absolutely false, end quote, Helen responded. May 5th, Helen's attorney wants Stokes on the stand, but he has been ill with pleurisy and has not been in court. Originally, he was going to testify against his wife's claims, but later decided not to. Then he was subpoenaed, and then he got sick. July 8th, the New York Tribune, quote, Mr. Littleton's request was that the complaint be dismissed as being based on unbelievable and contradictory evidence, and that the court sustain the counterclaim of the defendant for a separation on the ground of cruel and inhumane treatment, which, it was alleged, included attempts by the husband to insult, humiliate, and besmirch his wife, end quote. Helen's counsel, Mr. Littleton, said, quote, he was a man of prurient mind and devoted to promiscuous amours, utterly abandoned to every principle of virtue and lost to every sentiment of manly honor, one of the few people in the world who have no kindly feeling in their hearts. Almost from the beginning, he beat and terrified his wife. As early as July 6, 1911, the couple were married in February 1911, she wrote in her diary, Will smashed dishes at table. On July 25th, another scene at Will's. I made a great mistake in marrying. Indeed, the plaintiff's counsel candidly confesses that his client had faults along with his good qualities, but they must admit that this record fails to disclose any of the latter. The plaintiff showed little delicacy, if it were more than the gloating of a sneering satyr, when he sent word to Mrs. Miller, mother of Mrs. Stokes, as she lay stricken with the news of her daughter's runaway marriage, that he was not so bad as he was painted. And yet Mrs. Stokes loved this man and kept on loving him almost to the end. She was not happy except for a few days. Yet the letters she wrote to him testified to the endurance of her love, and she spoke the truth when she swore she loved him up to the moment she entered the courtroom, for until then she had never brought herself to believe the threat which was hurled at her when she spurned his offer of freedom and riches. How mysterious and how true is the ancient saying, husbands are often adored for their coldness, hardness, arrogance, and contemptuousness. End quote. July 15th, 1921. Helen has won the fight for her children. Mr. Stokes's brief, quote, if in the judgment of the court it seems wise, the plaintiff would gladly consent that the custody of the children should be awarded to the grandmother during their tender years, realizing that thereby the mother will have intimate and probably daily communication with them, as they will occupy the same home. In that event, the father begs that he may be allowed such privileges of visitation as will enable him to keep in touch with the hearts of his children and care for their physical and mental welfare. By feeling that they still, in a sense, belong to him, he will provide liberally for them after his death. End quote. Oh, really? Put a pushpin on that remark for later. Stokes's attorney, Mr. Smith. Quote, please notice that Mr. Stokes does not agree to such disposition of the children. I mean to say that this is not a settlement. Mr. Stokes suggests that such disposition may be the judgment of the court. End quote. September 20th, 1921. No divorce granted for Stokes. Judge Finch said, quote, to give the plaintiff a divorce which would practically also question the parentage of the children, although in fairness to the plaintiff, it should be said that no attempt has been made to prove their illegitimacy. There must be offered proof of exact times and places, and if upon the times and places, as testified to by the witnesses for the plaintiff, it has not been proved that the offenses took place, The decree cannot be awarded. The love letter she wrote to her husband made it difficult to believe she could have suffered as much as she said she had." End quote. October 7th. Helen has been found not guilty of all charges Stokes brought against her. The complaint against her from Stokes has been dismissed by Judge Finch of the New York Supreme Court. She will receive a decree of separation with an allowance, and she will have custody of her children. Although Stokes had leaned in with the testimony about her being seen in Wallace's apartment with all of the alleged eyewitnesses, the judge said the court could not be satisfied with the accuracy of this testimony. He also believed that Helen had exaggerated the charges of cruelty. Stokes was never on the stand, having been sick. The testimony of Mr. and Mrs. Matiosian was discredited. From where they were, they could not have looked into the rooms of Wallace from their own apartment as they had stated. Mrs. de Aquinas' testimony about her having been in the apartment when Helen was also discredited, but it wasn't said why. November 25th. The alimony question would stay as is for now, with her getting $1,500 a month. She wanted it to be fixed permanently while she was in New York from Denver. This was protested by Stokes' counsel because Stokes' bookkeeper was sick. Helen's counsel was willing to allow for a delay, but only if Stokes paid all of Helen's expenses. Stokes' counsel and the judge agreed, but Stokes' person is a wee bit afraid of Stokes' temper, so has decided to hold over the decision until January. Now, 1922. We're going to be glossing over this because, my God. So, she's fighting for her dower rights and for alimony. We're back in court. She wants $100,000 per year in support of herself and their 2 children. The dower rights are related to millions of dollars of property in New York. This feels like a rehashing of the divorce suit. So remember her not remembering what she signed. She told her mother in a letter, quote, "When I asked him what the paper was, he swore and tore around. I thought, why, of course I should sign it. So I put my name on it just for peace and never thought of it being suspicious." End quote. May 1922. $75,000 per year is being asked, now, in full custody of the children. Dower rights are being dealt with in the Supreme Court separately. By July, her rights have been restored to her. October, he wants a new divorce trial. And dude, Judge Finch never signed her separation decree, so yeah, we're doing a rehearing. 1923, Helen is suing Weddy, Mr. Stokes' son, for perjury for $1 million for providing that lying letter insinuating that the two had had a dalliance. This all goes on for a while, I just can't but to summarize this rehearing. Through a signed agreement with Stokes, Helen will be granted a separation from her husband, given the interest on an $800,000 cash trust fund to be paid to her throughout her life, awarded the custody of both children. She has to agree to give up her dower rights, to refrain from contesting his will if he dies before her. And to withdraw her slander suit against his son. On her death, the trust fund will go to her children. He can visit the kids whenever he wants, but not alone without her permission. All legal action will be withdrawn, including his appeal of a jury verdict that denied him divorce. The defamation suit will be left pending, and that's coming up next. 1924. He didn't get his divorce. He stopped payment to his lawyer. The lawyer is suing Stokes for default on payment. May 1924, more attorneys are suing for recovering their legal fees. 1925, basically, Helen drops her civil suit against Stokes, but her counsel continues the criminal suit for defamation of her character. He hired people to testify that she had done some stuff. They intend to ask for a 5-year prison sentence. He's not the only one charged, but he's the only one we'll talk about. For example, a photograph was shown in court of her being allegedly seen in a notorious club. She said it was taken at National Park Seminary. The house physician at this club denied ever seeing her there, but also could not give the exact dates he had been there. March 1925, there is another picture of her holding a baby, which Stokes says is a black baby and her child from a nefarious relationship. Her mother will refute this by saying this is the child of Helen's married sister. Judge Gimmel warned the state's attorney about smut. Quote, "You already have gotten much smut before the jury in the matter of the postal card, and I am not sure but what that instance has destroyed your case, and here you are going ahead with this matter." End quote. So how did this end? He was acquitted of conspiracy to defame her character after the jury was out for less than 2 hours. She will return to Denver, he to New York. October 1925, his attempts to appeal for custody of his children has been struck from the records. May 19, 1926. Well, Stokes has passed away at his home at the age of 73. No, not to worry, kids. Unlike my other stories, there was no murder or anything. His health hadn't been the greatest through the courses of the trials, and he died of double pneumonia. May 27, 1926. Stokes's will was filed for probate, leaving his wife nothing, nor anything for his children with her. Remember that he had said he would provide for the children? Yet. Her attorney will contest the will. After the filing of the will, Mr. Untermeyer, her attorney, received a telegram from Judge Ben Lindsay of Denver directing Untermeyer to take immediate legal action in the interests of the children, who are wards of Lindsay's court. The will be contested on grounds of undue influence and want of testamentary capacity. Untermeyer said, quote, "It makes no difference whether the turning over of this $10 million estate to one of the children to the exclusion of the others was claimed to be a gift or a devise by will. The rights of the children will be protected." End quote. June 29, 1926, we're still fighting to break the will. July 14, 1926, Helen has been made ancillary guardian of her children during the will contest. She cannot receive any property for the benefit of the children until further orders. July 30th, 1926. The contest over the will is now over, settled by a compromise between Weddy, Mr. Stokes' son, and Helen. The children are to receive from $1.5 million to $2 million in addition to the principal of the $800,000 trust fund from their father in settlement of Helen's dower rights, as per that settlement done a few years earlier. January 23, 1927. Helen plans to move to Switzerland with her mother and her 2 children. December 27, 1929. Judge Lindsay of Denver has been disbarred from practicing law in Denver. What? Well, apparently he was given about $37,500 from Helen. He's the one that is over the juvenile court and originally had been the one to give her temporary custody, then permanent custody in the early days of the separation/divorce proceedings. Then when Mr. Stokes' will had disinherited the children, she sought the aid and counsel of Lindsay, and apparently he acted contrary to the ethics of his office as he was still on the bench at the time. He claims that he acted only as a friend, having received the gift of money from her in that friend capacity. He states that his conduct during the case was not in his duties as a judge and only as a friend without thought of getting a reward. More stuff with Lindsay, but I'll wrap up what happened with him later. October 4th, 1930. So, you know all that money Stokes had? By October 4th, 1930, his $727,556 estate that he left when he died May 26th is now down to $146,617 because of administration expenses, debts and payments to heirs. He had left the whole shebang to his son, Weddy. Helen sued for money for the children. She and Weddy had reached a settlement. Weddy had received $41,000. Helen, $20,500 on behalf of the children. Debts settled, $248,628, and admin expenses, $122,685. That's just incredible. Not just these suits, but Stokes had some issues otherwise as well, eating into his wealth, getting sued for this, that, and the other. June 6, 1933. Judge Lindsay lost his appeal to be reinstated by the Bar of Colorado. He's been told that he could be reinstated if he just said he was sorry about some things he said about the court. He refused. Remember, he was disbarred in 1929. November 1935. Judge Lindsay was finally reinstated to the Bar of Colorado. It's not said if he apologized to get that reinstatement or not, but they did sweetly make the announcement on his 66th birthday. Anywho, what a mess. So much of that mess you didn't even hear. This one was probably one of the uglier ones I've read about. Take-home message: I can't tell you not to get married, but just make sure you've got your personal I's dotted and your T's crossed. Don't sign anything without a trusted lawyer or 2 or 3 reading it. Who cares if the other person's insulted by you double-checking? You're protecting both of you, ultimately.